In this video, we'll talk about what is nuclear chemistry. We'll try to learn more things about nuclear chemistry, what are nuclear reactions, what are some things that you should be familiar with regarding radioactive substances and nuclear substances. Before we begin with that, let's quickly review some topics that we have seen before. For instance, what is the structure of an atom? An atom basically consists of a very dense nucleus in the center. This is the densest part. This is called as the nucleus. The nucleus contains two subatomic particles. The first particle is called as a proton, which is positively charged and is abbreviated by this symbol. So the symbol is small p with a subscript of 1 and a superscript of 1. The subscript 1 basically represents the charge, which is positive 1, and the superscript represents the mass, which is also positive 1. The second subatomic particle that is found inside the nucleus is a neutron. A neutron has a charge of 0, so that's why the subscript is 0, and the mass is still 1, so the superscript is 1. Then there are some other particles that are around the nucleus in an atom. Those are electrons. Electrons are negatively charged and they are usually given by this symbol, small e. Subscript is -1 because it has a charge of -1, and 0 is its mass because it's very negligible mass compared to protons and neutrons. Another representation that we have discussed earlier is the nuclear notation or the chemical notation of an element, which is written in this form. What this basically means is that this X right here is the symbol of the element, which is the element symbol that is found on the periodic table. A right here, which is the superscript, is the mass number. Mass number is also abbreviated as A, and it is equal to number of protons plus number of neutrons in an atom. The subscript is Z, which is the identity of the element. This is identity of element. Every element has a unique atomic number, and you can find this atomic number on the periodic table. And what is the atomic number? Atomic number is given by the abbreviation Z, and it is equal to number of protons. So Z is equal to protons. This is equal to number of protons, and this tells you what element are we talking about. For example, if you look up carbon in periodic table, you will see a number 6 written on top of carbon in the periodic table. This 6 means this is the atomic number of carbon. Carbon has 6 protons. Now, different elements have different isotopes. We have talked about that as well. So what are those isotopes? What isotope mean is isotopes are different forms of the same element where you have the same atomic number, which is Z, but different mass number, which is A. For example, carbon 6, 12. Carbon 13, it is 6, 13. Carbon 14, it is 6, 14. So these are different isotopes of carbon. Why are we talking about different isotopes? Many elements exist in multiple isotopes, and usually one of those isotopes is slightly radioactive. For instance, carbon 12, carbon 13, carbon 14, these are 3 different isotopes of carbon. Out of these isotopes, carbon 14 is radioactive. What does radioactive mean? We'll talk about that in a little bit, but basically this is carbon 14, which can participate in nuclear reactions. based on this. Example like this, TL 210 decays to give us PB 210 and one other product. What is the other product? So basically the reaction that's given to you is TL210 decays to lead. So this is my product. It is decaying to produce this, and it is also producing one more thing. The question is asking, what is this unknown product? How will we find this? We are going to find this by balancing this chemical reaction. What do we need to balance? We need the superscripts and we also need the subscripts. Now the question is, how do I find the subscript? In order to find the subscripts, remember, are equal to the atomic number. An atomic number can be found from periodic table. So if we look for TL on the periodic table, if you look for TL on periodic table, thallium, you will find that the number that's written on the periodic table on top is 81. So TL is 81. Let me change the color so we know which numbers are the ones that I'm writing now. So TL 81. Same thing if you do for PB, which is lead, you will find the number is 82. So this number is 82. Now our aim is to make sure all the subscripts match and all the superscripts match. So let's balance the superscript first. This is 210 equal, what's on the right side? Also 210 plus something else here, right? What is the number here? What should I add so that I can get 210? I should just not add anything. So that would be 0, which means for my answer, the superscript is 0. Let's balance our subscripts. 81 on the left side, 82 plus something on the right side. What should I add to 82 so I can get 81? I have to add a -1. That's how I can get 81 here. So the subscript here is -1. Now based on the summary table, which particles have a charge of -1 and a mass of 0? That is a beta particle, a high energy electron, which means your answer is the other product is a beta particle. Example like this, complete the following radioactive decay equations and identify the radioactive process. Okay, so again, how do you find it? You balance your top and the bottom numbers on the two sides. This is 11 plus something gives you 11, right? Because total on this side is 11, so on both sides it should be 11. So what is this number right here? 0. Okay, the bottom is 6 plus something should give you 5. This is 5. 6 plus x should be equal to 5. So what is this x right here? It should be -1. What is something that has -1 and 0? Beta particle. -1, 0. So that is your unknown here. The next reaction, 222 should be equal to 218 plus something, which means what is this something? This something is 4. Okay, next I have at the bottom 86 equals 84 plus something plus this number. Okay, which means what is that number? That should be a 2. Okay, which means 2, 4 is released. And what is this particle? Alpha particle. Okay, so that's an alpha particle. Next example, 6 on the product side, reactant side, is equal to 7 plus something. I'm doing the bottom ones, which means what is that something? That something should be -1. Okay, and this is 14, meaning this should be 0. Which means what is being released? -1, 0, which is what? A beta particle. Okay, the last one. Oh, nothing is known. Okay, they don't tell you what any of this is, which means I need to find what are the symbols, and I also need to find these superscripts. Okay, so what is this symbol right here? 9, which means how can I find it? From the atomic numbers. 9 is the atomic number for, what do we know? from periodic table, if you look it up, it's fluorine, which means 918 gives you 8 something. The atomic number 8 is for oxygen, so I have figured that out as well, which means what should be this? How do I find this? I don't even know. Why? Because the other guy is also not known. So we will let's first solve the bottom ones. Okay, so if we solve the bottom, this is 9, this is 8, which means 9 should be equal to 8 plus something. What would be that something? That something would be plus 1, right? So this should be 1, which means this is a 1. Okay, which if this is a 1, means it's a positive 1, and we only know one particle which has a positive 1, which is a positron, which means this is a positive 1, and I know what positrons are, mass of 0, which means I figured this out. So I can now solve for the subscripts. This is 18 superscripts. This is 18 on one side, on the other side it should also be 18, equal to 0 plus something, and what is that something? 18, which means my answer is 8018 gives me a positron. So that's how you can solve these nuclear reactions or complete these nuclear reaction equations. So the next question is, because there's so much radiation that occurs during a nuclear reaction, there are different types of radiations or decays that occur. Can we protect ourselves from these particles, and how can we do so? So depending on their size, depending on their mass, different particles have different penetration power, meaning the ability of these particles that they can actually pass through different materials. That is called their penetration power. Alpha particles are really heavy, so they cannot pass through objects that easy. They have very low or the least penetration power of all the type of decays we have seen. Just be putting a small piece of paper, a thin piece of paper in front of alpha particles cannot pass through it. Beta particles, on the other hand, have a little more penetration power. They can pass through human skin cells, but they cannot pass through a piece of metal. Neutrons, on the other hand, have more penetration power, and they can even pass through metal. Gamma radiation, on the other hand, is the radiation which has the highest penetration power. These are the radiations that can pass through almost every single object. They are so high in energy that they can just penetrate through bigger chunks of concrete, big pieces of metal, for example, lead. Gamma radiation has the highest penetration power. But if it has the highest penetration power, does it mean that it's the worst for us? That is called as ionizing ability of the radiation. Penetration power only tells you what is the ability of these particles to pass through materials. Ionization ability tells you what is the ability of these particles to ionize the substances that they pass through, to damage the substances that they pass through. Okay, so that's slightly different from penetration power. To understand the ionization ability, we will first try and understand what is electromagnetic radiation or electromagnetic spectrum. So all the radiation around us that you see, that is part of electromagnetic radiation. We have light around us, we have energy around us, you have heat that is traveling around us, right? All of this basically is part of electromagnetic radiation. These are all different types of waves that you're seeing. These are all part of, right here, all these types of waves that you see, these are all different part of electromagnetic radiation. For example, on the left side we have the lowest energy particles, and on the right side we have the highest energy particles. For instance, you might have heard of radio waves, the waves that are basically used for transmitting radio signals. Those are the radio waves. They are low in energy, so they are always around us, but they are not that harmful for us. Then we might have heard of microwaves. Microwave is the exact type of wave or exact type of radiation that exists in our microwaves that we use to heat food. So that is microwaves. Infrared radiation, the radiation that we usually get from heaters. You remember those electric heaters that usually turn red when you pass electric current, and that radiation basically gives us heat. that is called infrared radiation. That is also a type of radiation. Then we have a very small part of this electromagnetic radiation is the visible light. Okay, all of these lights are basically part of the radiation. There's a very small part that we humans call as light, which is visible to us. So all of this exists around us. Only a very small part of this radiation is visible to our eyes. That is the portion that we call as visible light. That is the different colors that we see in light, rainbow colors. That is a very small part of the spectrum. So you can see this whole gray area is the electromagnetic radiation, and this tiny little portion of it is what is visible to human eye. Okay, then we come into the radiation that is usually harmful for us. So it's a little more higher in energy. You can see these radiations are higher in energy. Example, UV rays. We all know ultraviolet radiation. UV rays are not good for exposure towards humans, right, or animals in general. So that is UV rays because it is higher in energy, so it can cause more damage. Then we have X-rays. X-rays are the same exact rays that are used in the medicine X-ray technique that is used. Then finally, we have the highest energy radiation, which is gamma rays. So these are all different types of radiations. It's just that depending on their energy level, some of these radiations are bad for us. Exposure to these radiation is bad, and for some, it is not that bad. Okay. Exposure to every radiation kind of is bad. It's just that these radiation require a very high amount of exposure. Only then these are going to be bad for us. Okay, so usually we are not exposed to very high amount of radio waves. The amount of radio waves that we are usually exposed to is not damaging for us. Whereas a small amount of UV radiation can be damaging. X-rays, small amount can be damaging. Okay. The interesting thing actually here is a little bit about history. X-rays were the first rays that were discovered as the radioactive material. So first thing that was discovered was X-rays. Then came the discovery of other radioactive substances like uranium, polonium, and those were discovered by Madame Curie. You might have heard of Madame Curie, who won 2 Nobel Prizes. So she and her husband basically were the ones who were working on the radioactive materials, and they discovered the radioactive materials. But before that, X-rays were already discovered. Okay, so the interesting thing is X-rays at that time when they were discovered, people were not aware that X-rays are that bad for us. So they were using X-rays to just, measure the size of the foot. So if we wanted to measure what is the size of a person's foot, they would just conduct an X-ray, and it was like a fun thing to be done that, oh wow, this X-ray can tell us what is the exact measurement of somebody's foot. Because X-rays can help you figure out the exact bone structure, right? So X-rays were used basically just like in general previously, and that's when people started to realize, some people conducted experiments and they realized that continuous or more exposure to X-rays is really bad for humans because it can cause damage to the cells, and it can cause peeling of the skin. So that's when people figured out that, okay, we do not want to expose ourselves to X-rays. Same thing happened with radioactive material. When Madame Curie was working, nobody was aware that exposure to radioactive material is bad or harmful for us. So that is why Madame Curie, she used to work with radioactive material in general. She was not aware of all of the harmful effects, right? So that's how these were discovered, when she suffered through a lot of ailments caused because of the exposure to radioactive material. So all these things were discovered over time. Anyways, coming back, like I mentioned, not every radiation is bad for us. So that depends on how some of the radiations that are ionizing, some of the radiations are non-ionizing. So you can see right here, all these radiation, for example, radio waves, microwaves, infrared, visible region, all these are non-ionizing radiation. So they do not ionize the molecules that are present in our cells. Okay, ionize basically means they break the molecules into ions. For example, in general, I would just mention like in ions, for example, if you take any salt, NaCl, it's ionic compound, right? It can break into ions like Na plus and Cl minus, just to very briefly explain in like layman language. That's what ionization means. It can break bonds. So if you know everything's chemistry, in our cells, we have bunch of biomolecules like proteins, right, that do very important functions. They are interacting with each other through bonds, covalent bonds. If these bonds are broken because of the radiation, then we don't have good and functional proteins, and that can cause damaging effects. So that is what ionizing means. If your radiation is ionizing, it can break these bonds and it will ionize your atoms. And what are those ionizing radiation? Example, UV rays, X-rays, gamma rays. They can break the bond. Because of the broken bond, sometimes they can break and damage the DNA. And if the DNA is damaged, that damage sometimes is irreparable, meaning it cannot be repaired back. And that is what usually leads to cancer or other diseases, right? So what do we use to prevent our exposure to these radiations? Well, we do not get X-rays whenever we want, right? So X-rays is only recommended whenever it's absolutely necessary. We try and limit our exposure to UV rays. UV rays that we can get includes 3 types: A, B, and C. C is the worst kind of UV radiation, but that is already prevented by the ozone layer around Earth. So the atmosphere prevents that from coming to Earth. But we do get a little bit of A and B, and both of these can actually lead to cancer. So the best is we prevent ourselves and protect ourselves from exposing to these. How? By use of sunscreen and sunblock. Okay, so the best is, like, you probably have heard of these, that sunscreens come with SPF. What is SPF? SPF is something that helps and prevents the exposure to UVB rays. Okay, so SPF only helps with UVB. And what helps with UVA is the broad spectrum. So that is why if you want to use sunblock or sunscreens, make sure it is broad spectrum and has at least an SPF of 30. That is what is recommended. Anything above 30 is good, but honestly, anything above 30 does not help as much, or it's not much efficient than 30. 30 does the job pretty well. But SPF 30, and it should be broad spectrum if we want prevention from both UVA and UVB radiation. Okay. All right. Anyways, what else do we know about radioactivity? How can we measure radioactivity? Radioactivity has multiple units. Okay. The commonly used units are becquerel, which is also abbreviated as BQ, and Curie, because it was discovered by Madame Curie. So these are some common units that are used. There are other units that are also used as well, but these are the commonly ones. How do we measure radioactivity? To measure radioactivity, we usually use devices like Geiger counters, scintillators, dosimeters. Geiger counters are usually the more commonly one used, that basically can detect the amount of radioactive substances around us. Now, the next topic, usually in case of radioactive decay, is half-life. What is half-life? All the radioactive material have a unique half-life to them. Half-life is the amount of time it takes for a sample of an isotope to get to half of its original number of atoms. Okay, it's also written as T with a subscript of half, meaning half-life. This simply means that, let's say I started with 100 grams of a sample. After one half-life, what I will have is half of the sample. 50 grams will be left. After the second half-life, I will have half of 50, which is 25 grams. After another half-life passes, I would have maybe half of this, not maybe, I would have half of this, which is 12.5 grams. So that is what half-life means, the amount of time in which half of the sample decays, and what's left is only half of the starting number. So 50 grams is gone and 50 grams is left. After the second half-life, 50 grams was the starting material, so 25 is decayed and 25 is left. That is what half-life means. Okay, every radioactive material has a unique half-life. So some have it in seconds, some have it in minutes, some have it in hours, days, some even have it in years, like thousands of years. Okay, so what you need to remember is that what is half-life? Every half-life, the amount of substance becomes half of its original value. Okay, another very easy way to figure out how much sample is left is this. The fraction of sample that is left after n half-life is 1/2 to the power n. For instance, let's say I started with a sample which was 100 grams. How much of this sample is left after 4 half-lives? Okay, how much sample is left? 100 is what I had, multiplied by the fraction 1/2 to the power n. And what is n? N is the number of half-lives, which is 4. So 100 divided by 2 to the power 4 essentially means 100 multiplied by 1/, which is going to be 100 times 1/16. If you plug this in, it gives you 6.25 grams. So after 4 half-lives, 6.25 grams will be left. Either you do it by this shortcut or you do this. 100 becomes 50. This is 1 half-life. This is 2 half-life. This is 3 half-life. Then after one more, which is the 4th half-life, we have half of 6.5, which is 6.25 grams. So either you can do this long approach or you can use this short approach. Either way, you can get to the final answer. Okay. Questions could be like this. A sample of actinide 225 originally contained 8 micrograms. After 30 days, how much of the original actinide sample remains? The half-life of this isotope is 10 days. So half-life is 10 days. The time that has passed is 30 days. Okay. And what the initial amount was 8 micrograms. So question is asking after 3 half-lives. After 30 days. How much sample is left? Okay. How will we find how many half-lives have passed? During this time, 30 days means 3 half-lives have passed, right? 30 by 10 gives you 3 half-lives. So we know that how much sample is left? 1/2 to the power 3 times the original amount, 8 micrograms, which is going to be 8.0 micrograms times 1/2 cube. 2 times 2 times 2, which is 8, which gives you 1.0 micrograms. So this is how much sample is left. If you want to use the other way, that is totally fine. You start with 8.0 micrograms. After 1 half-life, 4 is left. After second half-life, half of 4, which is 2, is left. After third half-life, half of 2, which is 1, is left. So either way, your final answer is 1. Now let's look at some of the applications of these radiation. We saw that exposure to these radiations is really bad for us, right? It can damage our cells. It can damage the functioning of our cells. It can sometimes lead to permanent damage. But there are also some applications. For example, we saw X-rays. X-rays can be used to actually get a contrast image. X-rays can penetrate through our soft tissue, through our muscles, but it cannot penetrate through the bone. So using that, we can create a contrast image where we can see the structure of the bones, and it's usually used when there are fractures or anything, right? We want to know about our bone. So X-rays. Other type of scans that you might have heard of, PET scans, CT scans, they're all done. They're usually done with help of radioactive material. For example, CT scan is like a 3D X-ray machine. So kind of like this. The X-ray, in case of X-ray machine, it's usually conducted like a 2D. It gives you a picture like this, where X-rays is a person is exposed to X-rays from one end, whereas CT scan is like a 3D X-ray machine. So the X-ray moves around the person. So you can get like 3D scans. PET scan is also based on a similar approach. We inject some radioactive material into the person, some material which is okay to be injected into. Okay. Radiation therapy is also often used in cancer treatment. That is also, what is that radiation therapy? That is based off of these radioactive materials, radiation. Some radiation in some calculated amounts are okay to be exposed to for medical purposes. Okay, and that is what is used in cancer treatment. But you might have also heard that radiation therapy is not that effective sometimes. It has a lot of side effects at the same time, because this radiation therapy will affect the healthy cells as well. Okay, so it has to be done in a very proper, timed, calculated manner for it to be effective. Some other applications of nuclear chemistry are, for example, carbon dating. You might have heard of carbon dating. What is carbon dating? It is an approach or a technique that is used to figure out what is the age of some of the organic materials, some of the fossils that are found. Okay, for example, people know, oh, this fossil that we have found is like 8,000 years old. How do we know that? Usually carbon dating can be done. What is carbon dating? It's based on the ratio of carbon 12 and carbon 14. Like I mentioned earlier, carbon 14 is a radioactive material. Okay, carbon 14 is radioactive. All the living organisms have, when we consume carbon, we consume an amount of carbon 14 and carbon 12. Okay, so the carbon 14 and carbon 12 ratio remains at a constant level within them while they are alive. All organisms, living organisms, have a fixed ratio of 12 and 14. But after that, the 14 starts to decay because it is radioactive, and because we are not eating food, we are not taking in any carbon, we are not replenishing that carbon 14. Okay, so the carbon 14 decays, but because 12 is not radioactive, the 12 stays the same. But the ratio between 14 and 12 starts to decrease after death. So by comparing the ratio that the animal should have between 14 and 12 and the ratio to what the organism now has, that can tell us how long ago was this organism alive, or when did this organism die. So based on that, we can get the age of the sample, and that exactly is called carbon dating. Some other applications you might have heard, nuclear energy is can replace all the energy, or can solve all the energy problems for us, right? So why? Because nucleus consists of very high energy, which we talked about earlier, nuclear binding energy, right? Nucleus has nuclear binding energy. So all the nuclear reactions usually are very high in energy. If they are conducted in a controlled manner, they can solve the energy problems. Okay, there are two types of reactions that can be done. One is called nuclear fission, another one is called fusion. What is nuclear fission? Nuclear fission is, fission stands for breakdown. So we can break down, this is a nuclear material, uranium-236. We can break it down to give us two atoms, K91 and barium-142, and it will release 3 neutrons, and during this process it releases a lot of energy as well. So kind of like this reaction, you might have heard of nuclear bombs that have been dropped at some places, and the nuclear bombs that they're very high energy and can be used in wars and stuff, right? Why? Because they're very high energy. They usually involve some type of fission reactions in those nuclear reactors. If they are not conducted in a controlled manner, they can be used as weapons, right? So those are fission reactions. What is nuclear fusion? Fusion reaction is the one that usually occurs in sun. Okay, and they can also be done in a controlled manner in nuclear reactors as well. Fusion simply stands for combining. So for instance, here H3 plus H2 can combine and can give you helium-4, and it produces a lot of energy. So this is the kind of reaction that occurs in the sun, and it can be, similar reactions can be conducted by man-made reactions can be conducted in controlled reactors, and these will also produce a lot of energy, right? So all these are some benefits and some uses of nuclear reactions. Nuclear chemistry is also used to trace elements. For instance, how do we know that in our body, when we breathe in, all the glucose in our body, which is like C6H12O6, all the glucose in our body basically reacts with oxygen, and it gets converted to CO2 and CO2 and water, right? This is our respiration. Glucose with oxygen gives us CO2 and water. How do we know that this reaction is actually occurring? You can trace every single atom. Where is this atom going? By using radioactive element. Those experiments are called as tracing experiments. So for example, I can use an element which is radioactive. I can replace the carbon here with radioactive carbon, and then I can trace where that radioactive carbon is going, and I can trace exactly how it is participating in a chemical reaction. So there are multiple uses of nuclear chemistry. At the same time, if they are done in a controlled manner, if we know what are the benefits and what are the harmful disadvantages of these nuclear reactions and nuclear materials, and we can perform them in a controlled manner, then these reactions can be very, very beneficial, and they are used for multiple applications as well. Okay, so that's basically it about a little brief introduction about nuclear chemistry.